I have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled U.S. Seeks Greenland Grab as Pursuit of Primacy Accelerates. Yes, the U.S. pursuit of primacy is accelerating. There is no retreat to the Western Hemisphere. There is no desire to adapt to emerging multipolarism. The U.S. is accelerating its war against multipolarism, and that includes continuing its proxy war against Russia, also continuing its encirclement and containment of China, also continuing its proxy war, encirclement and containment of Iran in the Middle East. So let me read through this article. Let me show you why the US is so interested in Greenland and why this obsession with Greenland does not signify a retreat by the United States, but rather an advance. And if you look at a map, it is the US moving closer to Russia, not the US moving away from Russia, and threatening Russia to a greater degree, not to a lesser degree. And again, all in pursuit of things the US is already doing all around the world, not things that it plans to do in the Western Hemisphere, where the United States is actually located in on a map. Well, let's just take a look at the map and see where is Greenland. This is the United States. This is Canada. This is Greenland right up here. And if we look at Greenland and its location to Europe here and Russia here, and more specifically Moscow, because a lot of people will say the US is already really close to Russia. Why would they need Greenland to get closer to Russia? Look at where Alaska is. But Alaska is close to eastern Russia. And a lot of Russia's biggest cities, most of its population, its industrial base is located in Western Russia. And so Greenland is much closer to what is essential to target and disrupt in Russia if you are fighting a war, a proxy war with Russia, than Alaska is here in the east. And if you're trying to encircle a country, you want to encircle it everywhere, not just on one end of it, especially a country as big as Russia. Now, here is Ukraine. This is where the US is currently waging war on Russia from, primarily Ukraine. It is fighting Russians inside of these borders you see here on this map. It is also launching attacks from Ukraine deep into Russia itself. The United States, however, is based in Germany. US commanders are running the entire war from Germany. The logistical support Ukraine is getting from the US is based in Poland and Romania. But let's zoom out here a little. And let's suppose the United States says Ukraine's military is collapsing. We need to feed at least some nations in Europe, maybe all nations in Europe, into a proxy war with Russia, including the United Kingdom. We don't want to be anywhere here because it's a proxy war, and if we're in the middle of it and we get involved in it, then it's not a proxy war anymore. So where can we go? Where we're still close to Moscow, our proxies are between us and the country we are targeting, Russia. Where could we go? We could go to Greenland. That's where we could go. You could go to Turkey, and there are US forces in Turkey. But you're right there on the front. The whole point of this is to put proxies between you and the nation you're targeting. And what the United States is trying to do in Greenland, or possibly trying to do in Greenland vis-a-vis Russia, is what it has already done to China. The US has military forces in South Korea and Japan. It even has forces on the Chinese island province of Taiwan itself. There is a growing US military footprint in the Philippines. The US is disrupting stability in Southeast Asia through proxies, including in Myanmar. It has used Cambodia to wage proxy war against Thailand here along the border. There are also US forces in Australia. Look how far away Australia and Japan are from, say, Taiwan or the South China Sea. About the same distance or even further than Greenland is from Moscow. So this is not a far-fetched possibility at all. And then, as I'm going to explain later in the article, there's also the Northern Sea route, where Russia and China are sending ships along here, along the Arctic, through these waters. They come through the Bering Strait, they go through the Norwegian Sea, and Greenland is in a perfect position to disrupt the entrance here in the Norwegian Sea, and the US, of course, can already, if they want to, when they want to, they can disrupt it from Alaska. So it's very, very obvious why this real estate is so valuable to the US, why they're obsessed with it. They claim that it's to protect the US somehow from Russia and China, but it's very obvious they want to use it to project military power to disrupt and attack interests essential, and maritime shipping that is essential for Russia and China. So let me read through this, all under the guise of pursuing peace, which is in quotation marks. And this was what was literally on the big background during the Alaska summit between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. There was a big sign that said pursuing peace in the background, all under the guise of pursuing peace, which is not what the United States is doing. In a proxy war the US itself engineered and is for all intents and purposes fighting against Russia simply through its Ukrainian proxies, and to a greater degree, its increasing degree, its European proxies. The US continues setting the stage for wider and more dangerous escalation, not reversing and withdrawing and seeking peace and stability. No, it is seeking greater and more dangerous escalation, both in terms of expanding and emerging global maritime blockade against Russian, Iranian, and now even Chinese maritime shipping, as well as in terms of preparing Europe to feed itself into Washington's proxy war as Ukraine's fighting capacity collapses. I've been warning about this actually for years, that as Ukraine collapses, the US would begin preparing other European proxies to step into the breach. As Ukrainian forces crumble and fall back, there will be this desire to push other European proxies into the conflict to fill the gap that Ukraine's collapsing fighting capacity is creating. Continued and now renewed US interest in seizing Greenland from Denmark serves to accomplish both of these objectives, both this evolving maritime blockade the US is shaping, as well as continuing the proxy war against Russia across the rest of Europe. Let's talk about Greenland as a new base for wider proxy war with Russia. Existing US military bases in Greenland are located closer to Moscow than any other US military base outside of mainland Europe, including Turkey and the UK. Assuming that open US plans to have Europe double down on supporting Ukraine, including expanding military industrial production and arms shipments to Ukraine, as well as preparing European and non-European troops to actually enter into Ukraine, if all of this proceeds, and all of these points that I just mentioned, all of these were included in US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's directive delivered to Europe in Brussels in February 2025. Secretary Hegseth tells Europe, you need to double down on supporting Ukraine. You need to build up your military industrial base. You need to spend more. You need to tell your people, the European people, that this must be met with more spending on defense. Public funding needs to be diverted away from the actual interests of the European people and into this US proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. And of course, this is where Secretary Hegseth mentioned upping NATO spending from 2% to 5%, which Europe has now done. And he even talked about sending European troops into Ukraine itself. And now you see Europe doing literally every single one of these things they were told to do by the US back in February. But they're doing it under the guise of some sort of split with the US. They're telling the European public, we have to spend more. We have to spend more on defense because the US is abandoning us and Russia is such an incredible danger. That split is purely to sell this division of labor. Division of labor. Right here, Secretary Hegseth said, we have to establish a division of labor because the US needs to focus on China and Europe needs to hold Russia down in Ukraine. This split with the US, between the US and Europe, this is what they are using to sell all of this to the European public. There is no real split. These are the directives the US gave to Europe that Europe is now carrying out under the guise of splitting with the US, when in reality, Europe is obediently doing exactly what the US told them to do. Very important to keep this in mind. All under a US-led division of labor, US military facilities across mainland Europe and the UK would run the risk of dragging the US itself into any resulting Russian-European conflict. So then you could see why the US would be interested in another location where it could support this proxy war without being in the middle of the actual proxy war, which would then, again, defeat the purpose of having a proxy war in the first place. This would defeat the purpose of this division of labor. Thus, the US either reducing its military presence across mainland Europe and the UK, or relocating essential operations to Greenland allows the US to provide close but technically indirect support for European forces fighting Russia in the same way the US is currently providing close but technically indirect support for Ukraine as it fights Russia. The US is fighting Russia. It's doing it through Ukraine, and it plans to do it through the rest of Europe. And so what it needs to do is position itself in a place where it is in the rear and has its proxies between itself and Russia, who it is targeting. Greenland could serve as a base of operations for continued and essential US intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance support, ISR, without which neither America's Ukrainian nor its European proxies could effectively fight and successfully overextend Russia. It's not about necessarily defeating Russia. It's about overextending Russia. It's about stretching Russia and its resources out as much as possible to keep them pinned down so that they cannot commit resources elsewhere to other places the US is placing pressure. Places like Syria, which Russia was unable to continue supporting and hold on to. So Syria collapsed to the US and its proxies in late 2024, specifically because the US is successfully overextending Russia. And this is what they plan to continue doing as they target other areas around the globe. Venezuela, for example. And obviously, this wider conflict the US is leading up to with China. They would like to keep Russia pinned down and depleted. And there's other reasons too, and I will get into it. Well, with the US operating outside of most of Europe, it could project the illusion of plausible deniability amid a Russian-European conflict, enough to give itself and Russia the ability to avoid escalation into a direct US-Russian conflict, an escalation both Washington and Moscow presumably seek to avoid. For the US, the entire purpose of waging this proxy war is to have US proxies pay the full cost of the conflict while the US enjoys the full benefits of it, which is exactly what it's doing with Ukraine. It does not care about Ukraine's survival. It knows Ukraine will be almost entirely destroyed in this process, possibly not even exist as a nation state at the end of this. They don't care. That was the whole point of waging a proxy war. Ukraine pays the price. The US reaps the benefits, and it already has reaped benefits from this conflict. Again, Syria is an example of this. For Moscow, the Ukraine conflict expanding into a European-Russian war backed by the US is still a lesser evil than a direct US-European-Russian war. If Russia has to pick between fighting US-backed Europe in addition to Ukraine, between that or fighting the US-Europe in addition to the conflict taking place in Ukraine, it will pick just fighting Europe. I think that's a no-brainer. So that is one reason the US might be interested in Greenland. However, there is another reason the US has said it is interested in Greenland, and I am going to go over that. It is something they said all the way back in January and February when the Trump administration first came into office, and it's something they are now continuing to repeat with this renewed interest in seizing Greenland. So, for years, prominent US corporate financier-funded think tanks have published policy papers planning blockades to strangle all peer and near-peer adversaries into submission. And as always, I go to this article here. This New York Times article from all the way back in 1992, U.S. strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop anywhere in the world. No single nation, no group of nations emerges to rival the United States. It is called the Wolfowitz Doctrine. The article from 1992 specifically mentions Paul Wolfowitz shaping this policy. That's why it's called the Wolfowitz Doctrine. It continues to this day. The most recent national security strategy paper published under the Trump administration talks about, on one hand, U.S. global domination is wrong. We should never have even attempted it. And then for the whole rest of the document, it talks about how the U.S. cannot allow any nation to dominate anywhere, even regionally. We need to be everywhere in all of these regions and make sure no nation, no other nation can dominate that region. That is literally this from 1992. It is just another way of saying that. And so nothing has changed. Nothing is changing or will change under the Trump administration unless the multipolar world forces the US to change. Nothing in the US itself will voluntarily change for the better. And it's very important for people to understand and accept that reality. So for decades, actually, the US has been talking about blockades in particular to strangle all peer and near peer adversaries into submission. Chief among these adversaries is China. The US is obsessed with China above all other nations, is the nation most likely to challenge and even completely irreversibly surpass the United States. A 2018 US Naval War College review paper, and again, I've covered this many times, and there's many papers like this. This is just one of the more explicit and obvious. A maritime oil blockade against China. Technically tempting, but strategically flawed. And it's not strategically flawed in the sense that it should be abandoned. It's strategically flawed in the sense that this paper is going to explain why and then give a number of ways to remove those limitations. Ways the US has since removed those limitations. They even have a map here talking about a distant blockade on China where you don't try to blockade Chinese ports. You blockade these choke points well beyond the range of most of China's weapons. And of course, they're talking about the South China Sea, Taiwan, the Philippines, the Malacca Strait here between Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia. This is exactly where the US has been spending years and years building up military assets, specifically naval and air assets, to either threaten these choke points already. They are already being threatened. The US conducts these freedom of navigation operations through the South China Sea, not to protect trade through the South China Sea. Most of that trade is Chinese. It is to threaten it. They also are building up capabilities to choke off these straits in the event of any sort of conflict the US provokes with China. And they have completely reshaped the US Marine Corps. This took place under the Biden administration, just in time for the this current Trump administration, where the US Marine Corps can deploy from Japan or the Philippines, and they have specifically anti-shipping force, anti-shipping weapons, and specifically missiles, where they could relocate to these areas and interdict not only Chinese naval vessels, but Chinese maritime shipping going to and from China. So this is what this paper is talking about, and many other papers are talking about it. And they're not just talking about it, the US is taking concrete steps to implement the policy recommendations in papers like this. So a 2018 US Naval War College review paper titled "The Maritime Oil Blockade Against China" describes not only a strategy to cut China off by imposing a maritime blockade, you saw the map, but examines all potential ways in which China would seek to circumvent such a blockade, and proposes measures to take, which have since been implemented, to prevent China's success in doing so. So China knows the US is doing this, and it has begun exploring ways to circumvent these specific choke points: the Malacca Strait, the South China Sea, in and around the Philippines, the island province of Taiwan, between South Korea and Japan. China has been exploring ways to circumvent any potential US maritime blockade in these areas. China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, a network of land routes that allows China to circumvent many of these key maritime choke points the US has invested decades of military expansion to threaten, is identified as one of these possible means of circumvention. The paper suggests targeting and destroying these routes using the Myanmar-China oil pipeline as an example. The US policymakers in this paper say China has the Belt and Road Initiative. It can move hydrocarbons overland, circumventing these choke points. In an event of a US-Chinese conflict, the US can just use military assets to strike at, say, the Myanmar-China pipeline. Just destroy it, and then China can't use it anymore. It is beyond China's ability to defend. It is up to Myanmar, its government, to defend. It's been mired for decades in an internal conflict the US is driving. US-backed opposition and militants are driving. It would not be able to defend itself against a US attack on the pipeline, and so they could do that. Since this paper was published, and I've mentioned this many times, US-backed militants have already actually begun physically targeting this specific pipeline mentioned in this paper, this 2018 paper. And so we have some articles. I always show you this article. This was from 2022, China-backed pipeline facility damaged in Myanmar resistance attack. This happens all the time. This is just the one article I remember, and that has this very helpful map showing you the pipeline and explaining very obviously why the US is backing terrorists in Myanmar to destroy the country and to specifically physically attack this pipeline. There was this article from this year, just to impress upon you the fact that this is constantly taking place. Myanmar junta abandons Chinese pipeline amid resistance attacks. So there are areas along the pipeline that the government has had to abandon, which makes the whole pipeline useless. If any part of it is compromised, the whole pipeline is now useless. And so the US is backing these militants to compromise and sever the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative wherever it can. It's doing it in Myanmar. This is an obvious example. By the way, the Irrawaddy is a US National Endowment for Democracy funded propaganda outlet focused on Myanmar. It is also doing this in Pakistan, and I explain that in the article. There is another corridor of pipelines, roads, ports, power plants that China has been investing in Pakistan, and the US is using terrorists there to physically attack it. They're also destabilizing Pakistan's internal political affairs to divide and destroy the country, remove it from the table as a viable partner for China, and thus isolating it and also making the possibility of a US maritime blockade succeeding against China all that much more likely. US-backed militants have also attacked Chinese BRI infrastructure in Pakistan. I just showed you the Reuters articles from 2025. China's President Xi Jinping presses Pakistan to improve security for Chinese workers. What are these Chinese workers working on? They're working on the BRI in Pakistan, particularly in Pakistan's southwest Baluchistan region, where US policymakers have sought to eliminate BRI projects since as early as 2011. This was published in the National Interest in 2011. The title of the article is simply Free Baluchistan. And if you go all the way down to the bottom, they just blatantly tell you what this is all about. Pakistan has given China a base in Gwadar, in the heart of Baluch territory, so an independent Baluchistan would serve US strategic interests, to cut the BRI. So they're doing it in Pakistan, Myanmar, while they're also setting up a maritime blockade. But that's not all. It gets even worse than that. The 2018 paper also mentions Russia as a key partner of China, sharing a long land border and already exporting huge amounts of energy across it to China. So if the US tries to cut off maritime shipments of hydrocarbons to China through those choke points indicated on that map, they also cut all of the BRI projects. China still has a close relationship with Russia. It shares a long land border. It's very hard for the US to go in there and bomb Russia or China directly, virtually impossible. Let's explore that. The 2018 paper also mentions Russia as a key partner of China, sharing a long land border and already exporting huge amounts of energy across it to China. Russia presents a formidable challenge to US plans to strangle China through maritime blockades. Since the 2018 paper was published, the US has since begun its proxy war with Russia itself, and more specifically targeting both Russian energy production and Russian energy exports. Western media admits US intelligence helps Ukraine target Russian energy infrastructure, Financial Times reports. This is where the US, the CIA in particular, not only is the US arming Ukraine with the weapons it needs to strike deep inside Russia, the US is providing all of the targeting information and overseeing the attacks themselves deep inside Russian territory, specifically targeting Russian energy production. If you do this long enough, persistently enough, if you expand this campaign long enough, large enough, you will start to compromise Russia's ability to supply energy reliably to China. Whether they've managed to do that yet or not doesn't really matter. If they continue doing this, if they expand this, eventually it will, whether people want to accept that reality or not. Now, I also mentioned attacks on Russian energy exports. This is the US and its proxies seizing tankers carrying Russian oil or just blowing them up. So nominally, Ukrainian maritime drones have begun targeting Russian energy exports far beyond just the Black Sea, and have now carried out attacks in the Mediterranean Sea, the Caspian Sea, and even off the coast of West Africa. And if you look at a map, all of these places are very far from where you would think Ukraine would be able to operate, especially in the middle of a war it is currently losing within its own territory. However, again, it's very obvious what is going on here. There's an article from the New York Times earlier this year, March 2025, The Partnership, The Secret History of the War in Ukraine. This is the untold story of America's hidden role in Ukrainian military operations against Russia's invading armies. Essentially, it explains how the U.S. is running all of these operations through Ukraine. U.S. commanders are at the top of Ukraine's armed forces chain of command, not Ukrainian commanders. So the New York Times article, The Partnership, The Secret History of the War in Ukraine, would admit, this is what it says. It says it right here. Let's look. The Biden administration had authorized helping the Ukrainians develop, manufacture, and deploy a nascent fleet of maritime drones to attack Russia's Black Sea fleet. The Americans gave the Ukrainians an early prototype meant to counter a Chinese naval assault on Taiwan, or attack Chinese maritime shipping. It should be added. First, the Navy was allowed to share points of interest for Russian warships just beyond Crimea's territorial waters. In October, the leeway to act within Crimea itself, the CIA covertly started supporting drone strikes on the port of Sevastopol. And if the US Navy and the CIA and everybody else involved in this on the US side had to help Ukraine carry out these attacks around Crimea, so close to Ukraine, who do you think is helping them carry out these strikes in the Caspian Sea, in the Mediterranean Sea, and off the coast of West Africa? The US, obviously. And so the drones that they are using are American, and all of the information they are using to carry out these attacks are American, and even Americans are helping out in the operations themselves. The implication is that the U.S. is both supplying the maritime drones being used to attack Russian vessels, as well as supporting the drone strikes. That is a direct quote from the New York Times, supporting the drone strikes themselves through deep CIA involvement. How deep is the CIA's involvement in Ukraine? Since 2014, it's for more than a decade that they're talking about. Since 2014, the United States has nurtured a secret intelligence partnership with Ukraine that is now critical for both countries in countering Russia. So the CIA essentially took over all of Ukraine's security service, intelligence and security services. They are inside Ukraine running these security services. So when they say Ukrainian SBU carried out this attack in Moscow, killing a journalist, that was the CIA overseeing that. They facilitated that. That is the US doing that through Ukraine, just like every other aspect of this proxy war. More recent Ukrainian maritime drone strikes far beyond the Black Sea are almost certainly the product of US support being only possible leveraging America's global network of military and covert action facilities. If you're carrying out drone strikes off the coast of West Africa, you need a base to operate from. Who has a base to operate from, who regularly conducts military strikes all across Africa? The US, and who has the ISR capabilities required to find these ships and strike them? The US, only the US. So it is the US doing this. Even if they say have the French or the British as an intermediary, they still rely on ISR only the US has access to. Not only do these strikes on Russian energy production undermine Russia's own economic stability, it fulfills a primary objective in preparing the ground for a successful maritime blockade of China itself, eliminating or severely reducing Russia's ability to support China in the event of a US-imposed blockade on China in coordination with strikes on China's BRI infrastructure. The strikes are already taking place, and if there was an open conflict between the US and China, the US would itself begin conducting strikes where it could all along the BRI. They would also ramp up all of this pressure on Russia and its oil production and energy shipping, and then it would start targeting maritime shipping of all of these other countries. The US is already seizing Chinese ships. As a matter of fact, I link to this Reuters article. China says U.S. seizure of ship, serious violation of international law. They're talking about a Chinese ship, or a ship, at least a ship heading to China. And so the U.S. is already incrementally doing this. They have policy papers spanning years talking about doing this. They have fulfilled all the prerequisites to begin doing this. Now they are beginning to do it. This is what I'm trying to raise awareness of. More alarming still are reports that the U.S.'s current and widening covert and overt maritime blockade being carried out worldwide has targeted ships bound for China. That Reuters article I just showed you, specifically off the coast of Venezuela and Latin America. So when I say global, I mean global. It's not just in and around Eurasia, it's also in Latin America. And again, people who think the US is withdrawing to the Western Hemisphere and that's what this is all about, that's what this whole thing with Venezuela is all about. No. The US is waging a global war against multipolarism, which means it's waging it all across Eurasia, Africa, Latin America. As the US ramps up covert and overt maritime seizures and blockades worldwide, and again, covert strikes on these ships, blowing them up and claiming it's Ukraine doing it, the US expanding its presence in Greenland essentially corks the Russian-Chinese Northern Sea routes. I showed you in the map at the beginning of the video. A sea route that connects the Bering Strait to the Norwegian Sea via Arctic waters and has remained relatively out of reach of the US and its proxies. Beyond simply examining maps and speculating about US motives, the current US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has admitted that controlling Greenland is directly tied to controlling shipping lanes along the Arctic. So it's not me imagining this or speculating about this. The US has been talking about this since January, February, and they are repeating all of those same talking points now as this renewed interest to seize Greenland is back in the news cycle. In a January 2025 interview published on the State Department's official website, this one right here, Secretary Marco Rubio with Megyn Kelly of the Megyn Kelly Show. This is what Secretary Rubio explicitly stated. The Arctic Circle and the Arctic region is going to become critical for shipping lanes. For how you get some of this energy that's going to be produced under President Trump. These energies rely on shipping lanes. The Arctic has some of the most valuable shipping lanes in the world. As some of the ice is melting, it's becoming more and more navigable. We need to be able to defend that. But again, if you look at a map of the Arctic and the shipping lanes, they're here. They're over here. So why does the US feel like it needs to defend shipping lanes that would be moving primarily Russian and Chinese energy? Not to protect it, to disrupt it, just like in the South China Sea. This is the South China Sea repeated for the Arctic. So if you project what the Chinese have done, it is just a matter of time before, because they are not an Arctic power. They do not have an Arctic presence, so they need to be able to have somewhere that they can stage from, and it is completely realistic to believe that the Chinese will eventually, maybe even in the short term, try to do it in Greenland. What they have done at the Panama Canal and in other places where the US imagines China is taking over, where in no shape, form, or way they actually are. So they're talking about China trying to install facilities that give them access to the Arctic with the cover of a Chinese company, but that in reality serve a dual purpose, that in a moment of conflict, they could send naval vessels to that facility and operate from there. No, that is what the US is doing. They're projecting onto China, but this is literally what they want to do. They want to close all of this. Everyone else is shipping around the world, making things and shipping things. It's the US that needs to disrupt it to stay on top, because they're not shipping anything. And that is completely unacceptable to national security of the world and to the security of the world and the national security of the United States. That's what they wrote as the transcript, the literal transcript. While Secretary Rubio attempts to frame US actions as responding to a supposed Chinese threat, the purpose is clearly to close off any potential alternative to the maritime choke points the US has already poised its military forces across the Asia-Pacific region to close. They want to close all of those maritime shipping routes In the Asia-Pacific region, they have tens of thousands of US troops poised to do this. They have proxies poised to do this. If Russia and others can just use the Northern Sea route to move goods, energy, whatever shipping they feel like moving, then that is an alternative that diminishes the impact of this blockade the US is planning to impose in the Asia-Pacific region. So they seek to close that as well, just like they seek to disrupt and physically destroy the Belt and Road Initiative, as they are actually doing right now at this moment. That was back in January. And then now with Greenland back in the news, Trump says US has to have Greenland after naming special envoy. And Trump specifically mentioned Chinese and Russian ships as potential threats in the nearby seas. Threats in what way? And then again, this is exactly what Secretary Rubio was doing back in January, claiming that Russia and China using the Northern Sea route is somehow a danger to the US. The US has to protect these waters, when in reality it's the US seeking to endanger and disrupt trade in these waters. So the BBC in a more recent article cited US President Donald Trump and his specific mentioning of Chinese and Russian ships as potential threats in the nearby seas. While theories abound of why the US is targeting Venezuela and Greenland, mainly centered on a US retreat from global hegemony, in reality, the US is targeting both as part of an accelerated pursuit of Russia and China's encirclement, containment, and ultimately primacy. Not only does Venezuela factor into a growing global maritime blockade, the US and its proxies are incrementally imposing its elimination through military-imposed regime change further isolates its Russian, Chinese, and also Iranian allies. So again, yes, the US is operating in the Western Hemisphere as it targets Venezuela, but it is connected to the global war the US is still very much waging on multipolarism. You take out Venezuela, you isolate other pro-multipolar powers in the Western Hemisphere, you're also isolating further Russia, China, and Iran, the three biggest champions of multipolarism at the moment. Greenland seizure by the US allows the US to not only expand its maritime blockade to target the Northern Sea route, it also allows the US to fully implement its division of labor in Europe regarding its continued proxy war with Russia from a relatively safe distance. Just like the US is operating from Germany, Poland, Romania, backing their Ukrainian proxies in Ukraine to fight Russia. If you then want to feed the rest of Europe into this proxy war, you want to be behind your proxies. You want to put some space between yourself and the country you're targeting. You put your proxies in between. This is what Greenland affords the US to do. That is a very viable possibility. In addition to the blockade they are almost openly talking about imposing from Greenland. Only time will tell whether or not Russia, China, and the rest of the aspiring multipolar world are able to counter these accelerated US ambitions, or will be fooled by disingenuous peace deals and feints of a retreat to the Western Hemisphere. The sooner these US ambitions are exposed and checked, the sooner they can be stopped, and the less damage they are able to inflict on the world. And if you live in these places that are being targeted. I am here in Southeast Asia. I see what is being done to Myanmar. The US has created a proxy war on the border between Thailand and Cambodia. They have Cambodia picking a fight with Thailand to destabilize the region. These are real people who are dying, not just soldiers on the front line fighting in these proxy wars, but civilians are dying. They're being caught up in the middle of this, and they are dying. There are the lives of people, entire families being destroyed by what the US is doing. The quicker and the more people who wake up to all of this, who help expose it and speak up against it, the more people who work together to find solutions to stop this, the sooner all of this damage can be stopped. And we can all move forward together in the world we all imagine we want to live in, rather than the world the US has shaped and imposed on everybody, where everyone is at constant war with one another. People cannot just trade with who they want, how they want, cannot administer their lives, their nations, their communities in the way that they want. It all has to be dictated by Wall Street and Washington. So that is the article. That is the video. I will continue keeping an eye on this. I will continue to repeat this over and over again, and I will continue reporting on this as this plan continues to develop. It is very clear that this is what they are doing. If you go back to I already did a video back in February, an article and video about the US seizing Greenland, and I was talking about a blockade, about how it all had to do with blockades. And if you go from January, February of this year to now, and you see the US actually now seizing ships around the globe, using Ukraine to attack and destroy ships around the globe, it is very obvious that this is the direction all of this is going. So you know now, please help spread the word. Share this information widely. If you liked this video, if you thought it was interesting or helpful, please like and share the video itself. Please subscribe. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Hit the notification bell when applicable so that you know when I post a new video. In the video description below are all the other places you can find and follow my work. I post all of my videos on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Telegram. In the video description below will be all of the links that I referenced, including the link to the article itself. If you cannot access New Eastern Outlook in your country, it is blocked in many nations across the West, free speech. You can find it on my original blog, landdestroyer.blogspot.com. This is my original blog that I started probably back in 2009, 2010, something like that. It used to be called Land Destroyer. It is now the new Atlas. Superficially, it's still landdestroyer.blogspot.com. You can see all of my articles published, including if I have done a video to accompany it, you will see the article and the video here. You can access it here if Neo is blocked in your country. Also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of these platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. Again, the links to those will be in the video description below. If you go to my channel and you go to one of my videos and you hit more right here, you will see all of the links that I referenced, everywhere you can find my work, and how you can support my work. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare and you're just helping share my work, like my work, share my work, post a kind comment, send a news tip, all of that helps. That is what makes all of this work possible. I sincerely appreciate all support in whatever form. And as always, thank you for watching.